Please join me in welcoming Joanne Reid and Anand Giridharadas.
What a beautiful audience. You're all so attractive. Thank you for being here. You look great. Compliment the audience to start off. Always. Well, thank you all for being here. It is really fun to be here to actually get to have an extended conversation with Anand, whose book, I should say, is on the indie bestsellers list as of now. You can give that a round of applause. Normally, when we get to talk for a total of 6 minutes with 4 other people also talking.
With people yelling in our ear.
Rap! Hopefully no one will do that today.
Yeah.
Thank you to Aiden and Arden. This is a cool coupling. We have Aiden and Arden. Aiden, who introduced us, and Arden, who at a certain point will be walking around, giving us a time cue, and then she will cue your portion of the evening where we want you guys to engage, ask questions. There'll be a mic that comes around. Please, no speeches, but ask questions. All right, so let's just jump right in. Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world, a subtle title. I'm going to start by asking you, Anand, what is wrong with rich people giving away their money?
On the surface, nothing. On the surface, what is not to like with rich and powerful people spending some of their hard-earned or not hard-earned money making the world a better place? I became curious about the juxtaposition of 2 facts about our age that we'll all recognize. We live in an incredibly generous time by any measure. More money being given away now than ever in history, the giving pledge, but it's not just money, it's also like every elite college graduate wants to change the world. I mean, you have kids in that age group. Like, who doesn't want to change the world in that demographic? Someone said to me in the book, like, at any dinner party, someone's got one kid in Africa on an internship and someone else's kid is starting a social enterprise. So we clearly live in a time in which elites want to help, and yet this is the most unequal time in America in 100 years. It is a time of democratic decay and dysfunction, as you chronicle so well on the weekends. And it is a time in which most Americans have come to feel, I think correctly, that this society is rigged in favor of the few, doesn't work for people anymore, most people anymore, and the American dream that this whole enterprise is supposed to run on is a lie and a nightmare. And so the problem with rich people giving back, I found, is that it's not just not enough to solve those problems. I actually came to be persuaded that it was how those problems were being upheld. That giving had actually become the wingman of continued taking, an extreme taking. And generosity had actually become the wingman of injustice. And changing the world, and this talk of changing the world, had become the wingman of keeping the world the same so that your world doesn't have to change.
Interesting. That you just reminded me that I forgot to do my shout-outs. I want to shout out to Goldman Sachs, Uber, Facebook, who made this book possible. This book could not have been written without you.
Not possible. Not possible without you.
Their generous contributions to decay, as well as trying to fix it. I want to read a little bit.
In-kind contributions.
In-kind contributions, that's right. So
just by doing what they do.
Contributing their genius.
Just by being them.
Just by being them. They're wonderful
They
selves.
made this book possible.
Absolutely. Okay, I want to read a little bit from the prologue of the book. This is on page 9. Hopefully all of you were on book-buying moods this evening. Afterwards, you're going to get an opportunity to do that.
The Trump economy is great.
The Trump economy, there we go. It's like the gig economy, only with Trump.
Yeah.
All right, so here's a little bit from the book. And you talk about the myriad ways in which elites seek to change the world, but change things on the surface so that in practice, nothing changes at all. And you write, the people with the most to lose from genuine social change have placed themselves in charge of social change, often with the passive assent of those most in need of it. Explain.
If you think about someone like Mark Zuckerberg, okay, going around telling people he's changing the world, he's liberating mankind. On the surface, obviously, this is preposterous, okay? But I want to suggest that it wouldn't be possible for him to pull it off and reap whatever dividends he does from it if enough of us didn't sort of buy into it. Okay? It doesn't have to be a lot of us, but there's kind of circles of enablement of this kind of idea. If enough of us didn't actually think Elon Musk is a world changer, if enough of us didn't think that those hedge fund guys who go to Robinhood once a year and have a gala to help people in New York, if we didn't think they were saving New York, if we didn't sort of culturally buy into it, if the newspapers didn't, when Steve Case's wife wants to start an impact fund and they write this totally flattering article without kind of looking at the distribution of income in our society, all of that passive cultural enablement is what I find allows this kind of culture of extreme taking followed by some amount of giving to occur. And so I didn't just, I wrote this book partly, but secondarily to convince rich people to come correct and to stop living in a way where they are causing massive harm or sustaining that harm and then, throwing us some scraps to fix it. But I mostly wrote it for everybody else to stop believing these stories, because these stories, these myths, are actually what allows this age of inequality to go on. And I'm going to say, when I read that Thomas Piketty book that many of you bought and didn't read, I, as a service to you, decided to read it. But only when I started writing this book. And I, early on in the book, he has this line, and I was in the early phases of writing this and kind of aimless and purposeless while trying to figure out what this book was. And there's this line he has. He says, whether or not this kind of extreme inequality that we have now is possible depends on the strength of the apparatus of justification. And I saw that phrase, the apparatus of justification. And I thought, that's what my book's about. My book is not about the absolute levels of inequality and his R is growing faster than G. I can't do that kind of stuff. My book is about the culture that allows that to be possible.
Interesting. First of all, I want to say thank you, because now when I go to dinner parties, I won't call him Piketty. I thought it was Piketty, and I'm really embarrassed now that I didn't know it was Piketty.
I think we all did, because it sounds like picket line.
Right, I thought it was Piketty. Well, You know what? I'm going to be so much more acceptable at swanky dinner parties now. I want to get into that a little bit, because part of the whole myth of America is the Horatio Alger story. The idea that you can become wealthy and then go from poverty to philanthropy in one lifetime. And we sort of look at the Carnegies. You write about Carnegie in your book. The idea that the Rockefellers and the Roosevelts and the wealthy among us actually have the potential, because they have the money, but also in a lot of instances, they have the desire and the soul of return, of trying to give back. And you are kind of challenging that as a truly altruistic thing. Why?
Since we're just in an intimate group here, I'm gonna answer that question with the story about my own life a little bit, which is that I grew up with that story. Not because we were wealthy philanthropists, but because we were an Indian immigrant family. And a lot of immigrant families actually have some version of that story, because the feeling can be, we're these castaways who came here with nothing and we worked hard and so that was very much a part of my family culture growing up. And it's a story that always cuts off realities about where the status you may have had in the old country, which may have actually helped you get a leg up here, the fact that you may have been entering into my father came to go to school here, so that was entering into a privileged place, the fact that we happened to be among those rare Indians who spoke English when they left India. All of that gets cut out, and and I think immigration is actually part of the way we shore up that Horatio Alger story. We import people who are predisposed to think in some ways that they fought and made it themselves. And it was actually, ironically in my life, going to India and being a foreign correspondent for the New York Times in India, that I actually realized that what was true in India was true everywhere, which is that most people don't make their fate. Right. Most people in India, but actually most people here, aren't where they are because of how hard they worked. Some people are, but those are the exceptions. And I think with this book, I became very interested in how these people use the story of their own tremendous intelligence and fortitude to make the money, to justify a power grab into now rectifying problems that they helped to cause. In other words, the brilliance of the arsonist now entitles him to become a firefighter, because he's so good. When he was at Goldman Sachs, he was so good at that arson. That yes, although he was in the fire spreading business at that time, what matters is his aptitude at it, which was off the charts. Yeah. And now when you need an arsonist at some foundation that's fighting inequality, when you need firefighters at some foundation that's fighting poverty, or the mayor needs someone to be, the chief advisor on equalizing the economy or something like that. Charter school needs a board member. The arsonist is in pole position because he rose from nothing out of that Horatio Alger story. That equips him with this special power to now be the solution to the problem that is him.
All right, I'm going to put a pin in that because I want to talk a little bit more about that that kind of mix of altruism and also self-protection, right? Protecting sort of the means of gaining wealth. But what you just said sounds like your president. It sounds a little bit like the argument that Donald Trump made was, listen, I know all about, the way that politicians steal because they used to steal from me.
Correct.
I know all about
this
corruption.
Is so important.
They were corrupt with me.
Yes.
So I alone can fix it because I know for corruption.
We got to talk about this.
And he didn't rise from nothing. He rose from the nothing of a $14 million inheritance. But to a lot of his supporters, you even write here, and I'm going to read another little piece in your book. You say that people have an intuition that this cult of elite-backed social change is BS. And that Trump exploited that intuition, you write, by whipping it into frenzied anger and then directing most of that anger not at elites, but at the most marginalized and vulnerable Americans.
So there are two things there. First of all, I think what Trump did, the most positive thing I can say about him, is that he correctly understood a correct intuition that many Americans had that was underserved by other politicians, that the system was rigged and that elites in government and business were sort of in cahoots with each other and didn't care about, regular people as much as they proclaimed. He's not the first. I think Bernie Sanders also tapped into that feeling. I think Howard Dean tapped in, Ross Perot tapped into that feeling. But he did a good job of reading the presence of that feeling and catering to it and making choices to serve it. The tragedy of Donald Trump is that he then deflected it, and instead of harnessing that anger and going after some of the people who have hurt the working and middle classes in America, he suddenly made it about blacks and Muslims and immigrants and women and things that just nothing to do with that cause. The second important thing that you raised is this point about language. I think this is so important and so painful for many of us. The reality is a lot of Trump's language, and I use this word in heavy quotations, but kind of intellectual moves.
He went to the best schools, Anna.
He did. A lot of his intellectual moves are actually the moves over the last 20, 30, 40 years of the philanthrocapitalists, most of whom, in my experience, vote for Democrats. So let's just talk about some of those moves. I made stuff in China and Mexico. Yeah, I totally made stuff in China and Mexico. That's why I uniquely can go to China and Mexico and get better deals. That's the arsonist rebranded as firefighter. That is the same as what every philanthrocapitalist tells us. Because I work in business, because I work in hedge funds, I can actually go fight for working people and figure out what they need better than others. I can figure out public education better than others. When Trump, secondly, says, or does, I can enrich myself while fighting for the meekest among us, right? The whole thing is premised on that. That is the win-win, which is at the heart of this book. That is the phoniness of the win-win. The idea that many wealthy people have spread in this country, that they can have their cake and eat it too, that doing what is right for others requires no sacrifice. Again, he didn't invent that idea. That track was laid for him by perfectly lovely things like Tom's Shoes and these others that just spread this idea, a tote bag that changes the world, or a bank that can just totally rape and pillage, but also have an impact fund on the side. A lot of us participated in giving this guy a set of templates. And I think you don't get Donald Trump without like 18 parallel system failures that were uncorrelated from each other. A lot of machines have to break at the same time. And they can't all be the fault of the Republican Party and Paul Ryan and the Koch brothers. And I think that's where it starts to become an uncomfortable and painful conversation that I think a lot of us either bought into ideas or participated in a culture that allowed our biggest problems to be unsolved, that rich-splained to poor and middle class and working class people that things were great when they weren't, and that allowed this phenomenon to like kind of wreck our civilization.
You know, it's interesting that you say that. A couple things there to unpack. That you write about Facebook. You write a lot about Facebook companies like Amazon, Facebook.
Another
Google.
sponsor of tonight.
Thank you very much.
Kind.
Appreciate your contributions to the planet. But there is this sense that like Mark Zuckerberg, because he came up and created this high-tech thing, can fix education because he knows something special that maybe we don't know. And so that if they can just appify and gamify and give every, impoverished person, an app or a little sort of device, something technological, and put that technology in their hands, a lot of people do believe that kind of, as you say, techno-splaining to poor people, that you can actually make everybody have possibility. You think that's a flawed way of looking at things?
I think it was John Stuart Mill's dad, who wrote this History of India, and he famously wrote that he was uniquely qualified to write this History of India because he was not biased by having gone there. And it's interesting that that Mark Zuckerberg, when he spent $100 million to transform the schools of Newark, he had not gone there when he embarked on that.
Right.
He went there for the first time to do that. Now, I understand that colonialism and that are different situations, but they're a lot less different than you may think. I think what's interesting is, with tech specifically, which is a bit of a subset of this larger issue, I think none of us are fooled by like a banker or a chemical company or, just like normal businesses that just make normal things. None of us are fooled into thinking that they are liberators of man. We give them too much political power, et cetera. But with this tech thing, there is this sense that I think is rooted in a kernel of truth, that their tools are inherently empowering, which has a kernel, it's more than a kernel of truth. If you are a really great singer living in Algeria, your chance of being discovered in the age of YouTube shot through the roof. You were not going to get a New York agent, before the age of YouTube. So, okay, like that's powerful. And I think what happened is a lot of them bought onto that story of the inherently empowering, leveling power of what they had. And as that power has grown, as they have built monopoly after monopoly, as they have become basically the most powerful people in history, controlling our commerce. They got $2 trillion companies right now, controlling commerce, controlling discourse, by small mistakes, allowing elections to be maybe totally compromised, gutting our news business. My friends who work in journalism will basically tell you sitting across from Facebook is like meeting, Tony Soprano. It's like, you don't publish on our platform, no ads, we collect the revenue, like, hope you got your newspaper next year, right? We've allowed them to get away with that because we bought this story that I call in the book the kind of rebel king theory, that we've bought their own fantasy, that they are like rebels against the man, they're insurgents. Instead of understanding that they are not just the Rockefellers and Carnegies of our age, they are so much more powerful than the Rockefellers and Carnegies were, because they are in our minds, they're in our elections, they have a power over our children, and they have us all massively addicted. And we need to actually get our act together as a society and use our power to rein in their power.
Yeah. You even write that Facebook, despite calling itself a community, single-handedly redefined the word friend for much of humanity based on what was best for its own business model. And the sense that Google, as you say, they know everything you search for, everything you buy, every off-color joke you've ever typed, every utterance you've ever spoken in your home, in the presence of its kitchen helper, every move you've made in front of its home security camera, and you go on, Airbnb, all the control that they wield in your life, that you give them, right? That people are giving them this control by not setting their security settings to prevent it, means they're wheedled in. So what is the risk? Because you do write about the fact that one thing they've done is to step in and prevent themselves being regulated. that they prevent government from controlling them. So that's one thing they get out of it. Is that the only purpose of this, that they want to control giving so that no one can rein them in?
You know, one of the things that I found in the book and spending, because we're having a conversation about the ideas here, but I want people to know, like, this is a reported book where I went into this world for a couple of years and spent time with people to understand how these people are trying to change the world, and what I always do as a journalist, to try to understand it as best I can from their point of view. And I encountered what I would say is a very wide spectrum, from the naive to the shrewd. There are definitely people, and I think like New York finance supplies probably more examples of this, where where greed is definitely the primary motivation and the primary story, and the giving or the world changing or whatever is just part of the lubricant of the machinery of taking, right? And there's like an email I love from Goldman Sachs, in the November 2007, like, big New York Times story coming out saying, how did we escape the mortgage crisis while we were selling all these toxic things to our clients? They would end up going to pay a $5 billion fine for like what was described in that email. And they said, we got to make sure this reporter writes about GS Gives in this same story. But unfortunately, she didn't bite, 'cause she's like a good reporter. But like, that email just shows, like, they fully understand the linkage between the giving and like the bad story about how you escaped the mortgage crisis while selling toxic products to your clients. But I think in Silicon Valley, it's a very different story. I actually think that's the naive end of the spectrum. And I actually think the naive folks who, like Zuckerberg, like Elon Musk, who I think, as best I can tell, really think they are doing what is best for humankind, are actually a much bigger challenge for us. I actually think we know reasonably well what to do with like greedy people. We actually have a pretty, the SEC like detects suspicious trades, but like, it's not perfect, and we have a financial crisis every now and then, but like, we have a pretty elaborate infrastructure to protect against those kinds of greed. Idealistic monopolists who are deeply convinced that if you and me as journalists leave them alone, and if the government leaves them alone, they will simply be able to liberate Afghan girls and Algerian singers and Japanese politicians faster and better than any empowerment engine in the history of mankind. Those are people with what I would describe with understandable irony is like a Mao Gandhi like self-conception. And as those two examples show, like, that can go either way. And I think we are right now in the position of the society of just like hoping it bends towards Gandhi. Yeah. That is not a good posture. Right. And just a simple thing, I'm sometimes accused of like not being practical in this book because somehow people are under the mistaken impression that calling for the dethroning of an entire ruling class is not a simple practical solution. But a very practical idea that like some practical people in this room, more practical than me, should be talking about more and investigating is like what we do about monopoly. That is a very simple like thing that we should be talking about. That was a huge part of what happened 100 years ago in a similar moment. We need to be dealing with the issue of monopoly. Right now, these companies pose antitrust issues that are not really covered by the law. It's not straightforward abuse of market power because we all buy into it, and there's network effects, so it's actually valuable to us to only have one Facebook, and it's valuable to us to only have one Airbnb. And like, these are new problems that thousands of people need to be thinking about and researching and writing books about, because we just can't live in a world full of these idealistic robber barons who think they're liberating man while basically owning the society among 5 of them.
Yeah, and it's interesting because this book really does feel like you're writing about modern-day robber barons, but in that era, you did have a backlash of regulation to try to break them up and rein them in, and bust the trust, et cetera. This morning, as I was watching the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, Ben Sass gets up and he gives a soliloquy that was actually quite smart. He tried to do Schoolhouse Rock, right? He said, I'm going to explain to you how government is supposed to work. And the argument he made is that we, as ordinary people, we can elect our representatives to Congress. They are then supposed to create the rules of the road. But what's happening is, rather than Congress stepping up to their responsibility, their Article I power, they're essentially handing over their power to a sea of bureaucrats who work for the second branch of government, who are not elected by the people, who can make a regulation that affects this business or Facebook or Google or some business in Idaho, where that person in Idaho or Facebook cannot change it because they didn't vote for that person. They can't vote them out. And so the argument, the counter-argument to yours, is that the more you regulate these businesses, the less democratic, small d, it is. What do you think of that?
I think that's interesting. I mean, I'd be curious who wrote that statement for him.
Staffer. It's always a staffer.
Staffer was at Facebook 2 months ago and will be back there in a couple months. I think that's plausible, but I do not think we are at a moment of. I think there's some things we actually do overregulate, probably. I have a lot of friends who are very liberal and who have like small startups, and what they will tell you is like painfully that it like the right has a certain point about it being really hard to start a small business. And I actually think something we should probably do in America is make it easier to start a small business and harder to run a huge business. Because right now it's a lot easier to like be Pepsi than it is to start a restaurant. And like we should probably switch that up. But I think when I think about those branches of government, I think the real thing that actually disturbs me is that the givers have actually become an unelected fourth branch of government, and it's a branch of government that has some of the powers of the others. I mean, in many ways, they just make laws. They decide what a certain district school should be like, but they also kind of have the power of judicial review that the courts are supposed to have, and they just overrule the public interest on a bunch of issues. I mean, philanthropy in the U.S. last year was $410 billion. Okay. The New Yorker just made this point in a review of the book. This is the kind of thing where I was like, I wish I had put that in my book. They said that philanthropy is on track to exceed federal discretionary non-defense spending. Okay, now just think about that for a second. Basically, this is private government that we're trending towards. This is not like a little bit of the local ballet in Akron. Right? We are creating a parallel private route. And all of us in this room are actually working longer hours every year to pay higher taxes, to pay for rich people to have a tax deduction when they give that money away. Right? And it is approaching a level where it's going to exceed federal spending on education and the arts and various other things. And the question of what is that money doing, not at the level of each program, but how is it preventing what I think is the only real reckoning that needs to happen, which is the redistribution of power in American life? Not helping some people, not some scraps, not a charter school that you can boast to people about in Connecticut. An actual change in who has power in this society.
Right. And I mean, the sort of most direct way that the citizen exercises power, obviously, is over-electing the government. And you do write in the book about sort of the decay of government, which you make the point, and it is, I think, a valid point. If you look at the most seminal changes in the actual lives of human beings who've lived in this country over the last 100 years, they've come from government. They've come from the New Deal. They've come from the Great Society. They've come from the civil rights bills that were passed through government. So in what way does this fourth branch of government, this huge charitable, giving multi-billionaire fourth branch of government, how does that make government worse?
So one of the most common pushbacks to this conversation we're having, we'll start there, is like, well, government is so bad right now that we have to work around it, right? We're just waiting. We're waiting. It's like, when they have those like Iraqi governments in exile in Paris, and they just hang out in Paris for like 40, 50 years, just like drinking things, and then like when there's an opportunity to, go back home to Iraq and run Iraq, like they're there waiting.
Shout out to George W. Bush, who everybody likes again and forgets that he did that.
Yeah, he's great American president now, retrospectively.
Yeah. He passed a mint to Michelle. Let's be fair.
Yeah. People are just so hungry for someone to pass something. So people will say, we're in this time of dysfunctional government. The government can't do anything. So I'm here. I got this money. Why don't I do this social venture fund? Why don't I do this little program in Africa? Or why don't I do, whatever it is that they do? And that's a tough one. I think it's true, particularly in the Trump era. Like, clearly the government's not going to be solving a lot of problems. And I'm not against them doing that. What I'm interested in understanding is, what is the total effect of doing that? And my argument is, if government's atrophying, and then we use that as an excuse to work around it and solve more problems this way, government further atrophies. And then we solve more problems this way. And over time, you get to the reality we have now, which is $410 billion, and starting to close in on that federal funding level. So I do believe that this private giving, this kind of privatization of social change, in some ways is a symptom of dysfunctional democracy. But it's a symptom that circles back around and becomes a cause. And more importantly, it becomes a justification for not fixing government. And what I mean by that is, when the right used to just say government is evil and government's terrible, I mean, that worked on its people, and so it had a certain number of people that would reach, but it was always limited. What I believe this is trickle-down change instead of trickle-down economics. This is trickle-down social change, right? Let's preserve a society in which the government does little, in which the winners therefore win a lot because they're not being policed, in which social problems multiply because the government's not really protecting people and the winners are doing whatever they want. And then with all this largesse, let's us solve the problems. And what no one factors into that equation is what I call the winner's veto. When winners solve social problems, they're only going to solve them in ways that don't take anything from winners. Yeah, right. Have you ever heard a TED Talk about cracking down on tax havens? I'm serious. I mean, maybe there is. No one here has viewed it. Is there going to be Goldman Sachs got the green bonds, they got the prison recidivism thing, as long as they don't recidivize to Connecticut. They got the impact investment fund. Like, is Goldman Sachs interested in figuring out how to make taxation work so that, investors don't pay less than their secretaries? No. And would you expect them to? So when the winners take over change, they change. They do fake change. And the passionate plea for this book, through the stories of these people who are wrestling with what change is and how they can best make it, is how do we figure out how to go back to making real change in this country? I mean, ask yourself, to go back to what you said a second ago, just look at what you did today, whatever you did today. And no one here is your judge, whether you worked or, whatever you did. A lot of what we did in this room today would not have been legal for us 100 years ago, either because you wouldn't be in this country, or you wouldn't be working because you're a woman, or you wouldn't be working because you're a person of color, or you wouldn't have had the political power to, have whatever it is. None of that just allowed you to do what you did today, the basic infrastructure of our society, none of it came from powerful people throwing you scraps. It came from changing laws and systems and building movements to change the rules for everybody. And all of the most important things in the society have occurred there, which doesn't mean private endeavor is bad, but it means it's built on top of a set of norms and institutions and laws which allow us to build those beautiful private castles.
One of the fascinating stories you tell, because I'm a history geek and I love to go back in time. You talk about Carnegie, and you talk about the way that the robber barons sort of devised this idea of self-protective philanthropy, knowing that inequality would be so bad that eventually it would create social unrest, and the victims would be them. Like, they'd be behind the barricades while the rabble are out there, right? And so their idea was not to make the rabble have more, because we can't have that. We're not going to raise their wages. We're not going to do any of that. We're just going to create this sort of philanthropic shield around ourselves so that we look like we're not so bad. Do you think that today's robber barons essentially have just adopted that same philosophy?
One of the things when you write words, one of the things you hope, but basically never happens, is that a set of words you write will become so influential that it will unconsciously become the framework people use, And one of the only people that truly, not only, but one of the very few people that truly pulled that off in American life was Andrew Carnegie with that wealth tract he wrote, which you may have studied in school as the Gospel of Wealth. I mean, it is hard to think about a single document that provided the framework that basically to this day, 130-something years later, people basically use as the way to think about giving and taking an elite responsibility to others in American life. And what he basically did was, in this time, as you say, of rising anger, and a time very much like this, where there were all these new things being invented, a new economy was in the works, you had immigrants coming in and, scaring people as they always do, those pesky immigrants. And he wrote this tract that basically did the following. It basically laid out, the way I think about it, a bargain. And the bargain, was basically you leave us alone in the money-making phase.
Thank you, Siri.
That was deep. Yeah. That was.
As are we all, Siri.
I mean, that was like.
As are we all.
If you had any doubt whether Apple was monitoring this. Yeah. That $1 trillion can buy a lot of surveillance. So he laid out a deal where he said, you leave me alone in the money-making phase, and then what I offer you in exchange is I will give lavishly in the time of, grandchildren and reading glasses. So what was interesting about him, though, is he lived up to both. So he was utterly ruthless, breaking unions, paying as little as he could pay, and he said, I have to pay them as little as I can pay because otherwise my business is not going to survive. But then he actually gave in an extreme way, in a way that, by the way, people only now copy the first part of his thing, right? He actually believed that if you hold on to your wealth and don't distribute it, you are an immoral person. He believed it was wrong to die with any wealth. He actually believed that the wealth is not yours. His paternalism was that he believed that you were the custodian of it and that paying it to people as wages was wasteful, which is, why he doesn't look so good in retrospect. But in his defense, he believed in being as extreme a giver, and he built libraries, but he has laid the foundation for everything when people think about this giving and taking. And this idea that basically kindness ex post facto justifies anything goes capitalism. Yep. And that's the link. And so one of the people I write about in the book and spend a lot of time in a limousine with is Darren Walker, the head of the Ford Foundation. And Darren's big project that I write about in the book is to try to write a new gospel of wealth, because he understands that you need an intellectual charter to actually replace that intellectual charter.
Yeah, interesting. And if you don't know about Darren Walker, African-American head of the mighty Ford Foundation, which is pretty exciting.
So can I just say one thing about that? Mm-hmm. One of the things that comes up again and again in the book is some of the most interesting people in these elite spaces are people who are in these spaces and therefore very powerful, but as a personal matter,
right,
are on the wrong end of one or two or three power equations in their personal life,
right,
and therefore the women in my book were very different than the men in my book. And I kept feeling I need to find, but it was actually, there was a point there.
Yeah.
Being on the wrong end of certain kinds of power equations, and I think they're going to be the very important reformers around this system.
Well, we're very close to question time, but I have to get in before we go to questions. We've talked about Bill Clinton. You talk about CGI, the Clinton Global Initiative, and you write about it in the book. It is, in a lot of ways, the perfect fusion of these two things. Right? This is somebody who came, obviously, from government. He was a governor. He was president of the United States. He has this massive foundation that is, by any accounts, doing good around the world and giving money away. So is he part of the problem? If, as you say, this idea of sort of giving as a way to shield powerful people from consequences of the way they got their wealth, well, what then do we make of something like CGI, which is created by a former president?
As he said to me repeatedly during my interview with him, yes, but. And then he would just wait.
I think what you meant was yes.
Right, exactly.
That's more how you talk.
Yeah, exactly.
You got to do more Elvis.
I don't do accents anymore. I was actually brought out as a child to do accents for all my parents' dinner parties, and I retired early. Yeah.
I got your back.
Yeah.
If you need somebody to
Yeah.
do the accents
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah. We'll be here all night. I'm going to tell a couple things about the Bill Clinton story because it's interesting. So Bill Clinton was at Georgetown. I start the book with a young woman at Georgetown recently who graduated, and this is the story of her senior year and how she decides what to do with her life. And basically, she's in an atmosphere that's familiar from many elite colleges where all the options are about, like, you need to go work in business if you want to make a difference. So then I end the book with another Georgetown person, Bill Clinton. And what's so striking to me is if you were to go back to 1964 when he was at Georgetown, who among us believed more than Bill Clinton did in using movements and politics and the law to improve society, right? He saw Lyndon Johnson, he was inspired by the Great Society. He didn't go to Goldman Sachs for a couple of years. Like, he went back to Arkansas. He could have done anything, right? He could have gone anywhere in the world. He could have joined any white shoe law. He went to Arkansas and he made his life in politics. And fast forward to when I spoke to him in 2017, or the CGI that I covered in 2016, who believes more than Bill Clinton today in this new kind of way of changing the world, which is basically rich donors deciding what programs they want to fund and involving some agencies, involving maybe a union, involving an activist, but with their power to fund this or not, a model of social change that is essentially Goldman Sachs and McDonald's work together on a program to, help Pepsi build smaller Coke cans, whatever, that kind of thing. All the partners are here. And so I became curious about just how he made that evolution, because I really think it's hard for me to think about anybody in the world who traveled the arc that my book talks about more than Bill Clinton. And so I went to the CGI, and I spent 2 days there, and it was kind of this fascinating experience. I mean, they keep talking about they've transformed the lives of 435 million people around the world, according to Palantir, which did their analysis, which is another company listening to us tonight. And clearly they have done good work. I mean, I lived in India. I mean, they did the whole AIDS thing. They brought the price of AIDS drugs down by doing this only Bill Clinton deal where he got the company to take the price down if he could get the African companies to commit to a certain level of buy, and he did it. They have definitely saved lives and helped millions of people. But he said something that was very striking at the end of that CGI about this partnership, Goldman Sachs, McDonald's, Pepsi model of changing the world. He said, this is all that works in the modern world. This is the only way to make change in the modern world. And it took the breath out of me. And this is a guy who ran the most powerful machinery of state in the history of human civilization. So, a brief side thing, and I promise I'll wrap it up, is I wrote a version of this book a long time ago, a couple years ago, submitted it and was told that it didn't work. And a friend of mine read it and said, you got to find the love in this book. And that was a transformative thing. And I got rid of half the book, started over, and went to actually go even more deeply engage with people to try to understand it from inside. And so instead of writing this snarky chapter about CGI, which was my original plan, I wrote this long email to his staff person saying, I think he's traveled this fascinating arc. Can I talk to him? Expecting them to say no. And they said, sure. So I had this 90 minutes with him. And it was the most it was 6 months after the election. It was the most amazing and sad conversation. Look, there's no one smarter on these questions, and he understood, and he got it, and he actually talked about how he actually has anxieties that some of these Tom Shoesy kind of people around him in his world actually don't understand real change, and that he's always trying to remind them, you got to work with systems, you got to work with systems. But he was totally blind to the way in which the plutocrats around him have captured him. I said, you guys have made about $250 million since leaving office, according to the Wall Street Journal. Do you understand in an age of populism why that rubs some people the wrong way? No. I pay 47% taxes. I donate some money to my friends in Arkansas with medical problems. By the way, if you give it directly to the hospital, you don't pay the gift tax. And I'm like Robin Hood, except I don't even hold an arrow on them. That's what he said. And then we got finally into this argument about that just to me captures the insipidity of this idea of changing the world. I tried to craft an example of something that makes as clear a case for the government solving a problem as any. So the example I came up with was something he'd worked on, which is childhood obesity. These soft drink companies lobby to get the vending machines in public schools. These are government schools. These are children who can't vote, can't easily organize, have no countervailing power. Very, very well-connected companies. You know, seems like a good case for like using the power of law and government to like protect those kids who are dying because of this product that has no redeeming value. And he says to me, well, the way I chose to work with them was to do it collaboratively. And, you know, we shrunk the cans a little bit and it's not, because the thing is, if you want to make this kind of change, you got to innovate because they still have to have a business model on the other side. And again, my breath was gone, and maybe I need to get in better shape. But I just sat there thinking, a man who literally ran the most powerful and sophisticated machinery of state and human history is sitting here telling me we can't anymore protect children from products that are killing them in government schools that we all own in common because we have to be solicitous of the business model of Pepsi and Coke. And I just think if we don't go back, like that is not change. That is fake change. And I don't care if it's Bill Clinton or anybody else. That's not real change. And we need to actually go back to remembering how we made change in this country because it wasn't that way.
Yeah, indeed. All right. Well, I think, yeah, absolutely. Round of applause. Okay. I think my questions were awesome. However, one can always be improved upon. So raise your hands if you would like to ask a question. Thank you very much. We did sort of, I had a conversation with Anand afterwards about who asks questions. There is a psychology to it. And I always find that many women pop up their hands. So I want some guys to pop up your hands. Oh, I want everyone to pop up your hands and let's do some questions. Okay, so look there, we have a gentleman right here. All right, so let's get a microphone. We have a lady, you had your hand up. All right, so we're gonna start with this gentleman. We'll go to gentleman first this time, and then we'll have this young lady on this end. Sir.
Recent college grad, eager to change the world.
Don't you dare go work at Goldman Sachs.
Well, that's the thing. I spent.
Oh, God.
He's already
Oh, God.
accepted the job.
Wait. Tell us how the movie ends first, and then we'll do the flashback.
All right, so I'm here in New York interviewing for programming jobs. So I spent my entire senior year, much of the summer, applying for data journalism jobs. Really nothing, because as you, I'm sure, are familiar, it's not the best industry right now. Last week I gave up kind of, and well, I justified to myself I can learn a lot from Google and Facebook if I can be a better data journalist if I work for them. So I applied to consulting agencies and programming jobs last week, and I have 3 interviews already. So what am I supposed to do in that kind of position?
It's so much like the story in your book, like the opening story in your book.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you for just sharing that. It's not easy to share. If anybody wants to hire, we have a big enough room here and some great people here, so if you can hire this guy tonight, I would really appreciate it. What's your name?
Kevin.
Kevin what?
McAwee.
Okay, great.
From Princeton.
So just stand up so everybody can see if they want to.
Get this young man a job.
Yeah. We can do this tonight. Let's at least one. Don't say I don't create solutions, okay?
Yes, that's right.
Let it be known.
Come to the library. They say come to the library. You don't get anything. You can get employed.
Employed.
You come to the library.
Actually, a lot of people get employed in the library in America.
True.
Look, I think it's a really hard issue, and I'm going to unpack a couple of things you said. It may be that there are no data journalism jobs, but also what I find is even when there are, it's hard to find. They're not listed. When I was getting into journalism, it just feels like there's like no journalism jobs. It's getting a little better with social media. You have some average, but like for the longest, and it's true of a lot of industries. It's true of NGOs. So I hear this all the time. It's not necessarily that there are no jobs, but it's these firms do such an amazing job of catering to the anxiety of people at exactly the juncture you are, or like where you were a year ago. They reach in earlier. They have these information sessions. They actually, they call their cohorts like a class. the first class. So what do? They're making you feel like it's a seamless transition from senior year to like senior year plus. It's just, you're still sort of in a dormy kind of thing. You're working all-nighters. They actually replicate your psychology. They come in early and they get you on the escalator. You don't have to think. And so like, it's hard for me to tell you, it's hard for me to tell you like turn down someone who's actually treating you well as a new graduate and a smart person and very well dressed. Very employable, might I repeat. All I would say is like, look for opportunities to learn those skills that you want to learn that may be unconventional. Like some advice I got was like, go to another country, right? There are countries that are like very cheap to live in, right? Where you can like do something interesting and like, I don't know, if you want to be a data journalist, like you go to like an English newspaper in Thailand, right? With your skills, you may be able to do stuff that is 10 years ahead of what you'll be able to do here and like live on $10,000 a year, right? Like there's just, but it's not, but I think we're like, and for those who don't work in these, work in like, who are involved in hiring, I think it's important to think about how do you actually like compete, and I use that word somewhat ironically, but compete with the Googles and Facebooks and like make people feel wanted and make them feel like you don't have money to offer, but at least there's like some amount of certainty and psychology to like make people who are your age, like see the horizon of their future.
I promise this lady.
Hi, Anand. How are you? I guess I want to just say that I believe in our humanity. I'm on Team Human, like my friend Douglas Rushkoff says. But would you say that it's always been, and perhaps it will always be, that our democracy is at odds with capitalism, with our capitalism? So the winners-take-all situation is really just isn't that a successful outcome of capitalism? It's the haves and the have-nots. That's in our system. I don't want that to be, but it's my fear that in fighting against that, will we have a chance to win? I know that I don't want to be so pessimistic again. I'm on Team Human. But
I do not in any way think that that's the inevitable outcome of anything. We're a big country, so we forget all the other countries. We are the exception in the rich world. I mean, have you all been to like Germany or France or seen them on TV? They're fine. They're fine. They're not socialist paradise. They're not communist, but people don't like die of cancer because they're not millionaires in Germany. They just don't, or in England, or like whatever, wherever. Like this whole idea, we have been on the receiving end of a campaign for a long time that like actually very modest government programs that actually, and I don't even like to justify things this way, but that are actually good for business also, because by the way, if you have more talent lying around and not being like on the street battling cancer, it's actually, you like to have more going on in the economy, more people buying stuff, more good workers, et cetera. Like, democracy and capitalism have an adversarial relationship, but they don't have a mutual annihilation relationship. And for much of the last, particularly the period that everyone talks about, the kind of mid-40s to the, early 80s, was there a tension? Yeah. Were there like country club Republicans and people who wanted more activist government on the left? Yeah. But they also worked together, right? And like this whole idea of the free market, like, so just take something like Goldman Sachs, which we've talked about a lot tonight because it's a sponsor. Like, why didn't Goldman Sachs arise in some other country? Has any developing country produced anything like Goldman Sachs? They all want to. No, but hold on. Goldman Sachs, the existence of it is entirely dependent on this being a system, our public institutions being what they are. Do you think if our courts didn't work the way they do, if the SEC didn't work the way it does, if we didn't have public education that just trained people in a way that Goldman Sachs doesn't have to train them after they're hired on day one. Like, do you understand how much civilizational accomplishment lies underneath a Goldman Sachs? So that is not a relationship of one destroying the other. They depend on each other. Like, you can't have those kind of robust public institutions without there being any money in the society. We need money. Everything needs money, right? So we need some people to be making that money. And we need some people to be creating the infrastructure that allows us to live together, not kill each other. And in most rich countries, people understand that those are just two things that both need to happen, and if either of them happens to the death of the other, it's not good. And that is not a weird idea, and we make it weird here. You know, if you look at Germany, like Germany is a very interesting example. If you look at Germany's data on productivity, on the stock market, on wages, on profits, there are a lot of rich people in Germany. They just don't think they should be in charge of the society. Because they got a government in Germany.
All right, let's get some hands up. Right here. You, yep, yes, Stan.
Anand, I can't wait to read this. Congratulations. Speaking of rich people in Germany,
This guy.
I think I might know you. Wait, Gary.
yeah. So Dana Milbank said something interesting about the Trump administration having so many millionaires in his cabinet, and it's because he believes wealth in and of itself is a qualification. So I guess my concise question is, how much has that ideology crept up into the left, that wealth by itself makes you smarter and better able to allocate resources and to help people than, you know, the bureaucrats in the government? And then the second question is, I just feel like a generation ago, extremely wealthy people would have met everybody else in society, either in the military, in public school, in public parks, in public place. So what role does the isolation of both classes have in all this?
Trusted novelist, ask some. Look, I think those are both such important issues. I'm going to deal with them quickly. You know, on the first one, just when I was calming down, I'm going to get revved up again. I think one of the weirdest ideas in our society that has entered the left and like all kinds of people is that the special and very particular skills of like management consulting and investment banking are like somehow the universal access codes of intelligent problem solving. I actually don't think those skills are like worse than any other. I just think they're like, they're a little worse in some ways. They're very dehumanizing. But I literally think there are 1,000 professions, all of which have like an interesting framework that one could deploy to making the world better. So you think about a teacher on the south side of Chicago, kids from tough backgrounds. She's got to win authority in that class on like day one, teach them, identify who needs the most help, right? Like, I don't know, that seems like a pretty useful framework for making decisions about what our society should be like. But no one says you got to go do that to make change. People don't even think you got to go do that to run our schools, let alone do anything else. I don't know, like pilots. Look at a lot of data, risk, weather, right? That seems like a pretty useful skill to someone thinking about public problems. We don't say everybody's got to be a pilot, right? You think about, journalists, but journalists listen to a lot of people who say the opposite things and try at their best to figure out where the truth lies and where's the preponderance of reality and what are you hearing again and again that is some larger thing. That seems like a pretty useful trip, but we don't say everybody's got to go apprentice at the AP in order to be a change agent. But you have to go to Goldman Sachs or McKinsey or maybe now some of the tech companies if you want to be a change agent. So I just think that's preposterous. And maybe go back to your question, getting out of that narrative, maybe go do some weird job, just a normal job, that actually, if you think about it, that'd be an interesting skill to have for life. Because there are a lot more of those kind of apprenticeships than we often think. What was the second thing? Isolation. Oh, yeah, service. I think this is such an important, I don't know if this is where you were going, but we don't have these shared experiences anymore. One of the meaningful changes between the 70s, when this era of extreme inequality sort of took off, and today is like the draft ended. Not that I'm in favor of reinstating it, but we actually don't have any kind of experience that we do in common by virtue of being human. And I think it's actually, when I think about, again, when I didn't, I actually, my editor couldn't make it tonight, but I promised him a solutions chapter. He's like, we'll do a solutions chapter. I was like, yeah, totally, we'll do it. And we'll do it. The way we'll do it is we'll do it right at the end, and then the way we'll do it is I'll submit the rest of the book first, and then I'll just, like, while you're reading that, I'll write the solution chapter, and then I didn't. Because I think, like, solutions should be written by other people who read the book. That's my view. But I like to co-create that stuff. By co-create, I mean you create it. But one thing that I do think is an interesting direction, again, for you to run away with, not me, is like to think about, can we do national service? And whether it's mandatory or, one of the ideas that I'm always intrigued by is, you know, I think our society doesn't, government in particular, doesn't use its leverage very well. Like, we help people in all kinds of ways, right? If you go to Harvard, whether you pay full freight or if you take a scholarship, you're definitely maybe getting some government help. But even if you don't, like, federal funding is all up in Harvard, right? We don't drive a very good bargain. So you want to go to Harvard, like, do a year afterwards, right? You want that financial aid money, like, do a year afterwards. But frankly, you want that science lab at Harvard that had received federal funding, like, do a year afterwards. And actually getting people to some combination of, like, Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, but, you know, national service, maybe teaching, maybe whatever. And, you know, frankly, it could be blue-collar stuff. I think it'd actually be really interesting if we actually had a president, you know, who did an infrastructure bill. Like, I would throw that in there. Like, go build some pipes somewhere. Like, actually have some sort of shared experience of reality before we embark on these lives. I think that's actually, to be honest, one of the only things culturally powerful enough to countervail the very powerful forces that I describe in the book.
So I think one of the most overused phrases in the modern English language is literally. However, I think we could literally stay here all night and keep talking about this because everybody is asking such great questions and this is such a smart and interesting topic, but we literally have to now go.
Literally.
So we are going to wrap up now. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions. If you had questions, you can ask them to Anand yourself as he's signing your book, because this is the book signing portion of the evening. So let me ask, where do people go?
You're going to go out, you're going to buy a book right here.
Okay. Got it. All right, so you're going to go out the back, stanchions to the right, and you're going to buy books. Thank
and just
you all
imagine,
to the New York Public
like,
Library.
Imagine what it was like for me to not be a doctor.
There you go.
So buy the book.
Give Anand a round of applause. Thank you all. Give yourselves a round of applause. Thanks for being here. God bless you, and good night.